Center. For those of you who have made it here, you're aware that we're using a different link than we normally use. We have one of our members who is not available this week, and we learned that it's important to be co-hosts on each other's meetings. So we've had to use a different Zoom meeting link and try to get it out as many ways as we can. If you have friends who want to come to this and are saying, hey, I can't get in, feel free to share this link for today's event. Next week, we'll go back to our normally scheduled Zoom link, and we'll give you the reminders and all of those things. But today we are punting, which is something we sometimes have to do. So that's our setup. That's our context. All of this reflects on us, not our wonderful presenter today, who is Cody Walls. We are so excited that Dr. Walls here is to talk to us again about how that we can be helping ourselves and our students through very challenging times as the end of the semester approaches. And I want to especially thank you for being a good sport about some of the difficulties we've had in getting to this point today. So without further ado, thank you, Cody.
Yeah, thank you so much, Don. I appreciate it. And I'm so glad that you folks are attending. I see some familiar faces and I feel so fortunate to be able to reconnect with you today. I recognize that there's three main concepts that I want to talk about today. And some of these discussions may be more helpful for us than directly our students. So just if you're finding yourself applying it more easily to your own life right now, that's great. And I did try to make sure the language fit for like how you might apply this in the classroom or how you might try to cultivate this with your own students at this time of the year, because I think that at least at the agency at Counseling Services, we're feeling the crush of having not had a spring break. We're having lots of students come in and say who are what we would describe as decompensating, where they were fine for a while and then they're just like tanking on things. And so it's really challenging, and we try to hold all those pieces while also help them limp to the finish line, because the last thing we want is them to have made it this far and like stumble and face plant and have to go through all the processes of whatever Office of Student Life would be able to support them to do, or what you all would be able to provide in terms of compensation and support as faculty members. Thanks, Clarissa. And I'm going to try to keep an eye on the chat. I am going to share my screen. So if you would like, you can type questions in there and I'll try to answer them as we go. But I do want you to feel like we can engage in this conversation. And if we don't get through all of the material I've prepared, just know that I will be sending the PowerPoint to Ashley, and Ashley can send it out to everybody. So if you want to reference it later, just know that you'll have that information. So luckily I have two monitors, so this tends to go well sometimes, but with the way things are going, we'll just find out. So, all right. Oh, it's working. Okay, great. So I've got the chat pulled up in front of me, and then also we'll have the presentation over to the side. So, all right, mental health conversations. And as we get started, there's some things that I want to acknowledge. The reality of our time, COVID is still a thing. We were having kind of a chat before things got started about the way, maybe you had flexibility with your classes and some people were online and some people were in person, but that may have decreased a little bit. And especially these next few weeks could be even less actually in-person contact, whatever decision you all end up having to make. Also want to recognize that yesterday a significant ruling in the United States happened, and I don't want to have a conversation about mental wellness and not address that during our time. And it's beyond the scope of this presentation, but I do want to acknowledge that Black and Indigenous and people of color communities' lives still matter. And even though for many people the ruling in the Derek Chauvin case yesterday may have been a sigh of relief, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done, and that hopefully this feels like it's a small step forward so that we're not all feeling as depleted as perhaps we would have if the verdict had been not guilty. So we're going to talk about three aspects today, and that's going to be self-compassion, resilience, and motivation. And these are sort of like, I made the blobby because they're all so related, but I think in the center of it is this idea of self-compassion. So we're going to probably spend the most time talking about this concept because we're really bad at self-compassion in our country. If you look at any statistics about high schoolers and self-esteem and that concept, like Americans rank really high on self-esteem. They seem to feel really good about themselves. But there are certain pitfalls with self-esteem that we'll talk about in a little bit that are almost the antithesis of self-compassion, which actually can cultivate a mental wellness that we're not able to accomplish in other places. So, and then resilience and motivation, we'll talk more about as well. And again, just a reminder, thoughts, questions, put them in the chat. You can also unmute yourself and we can have a conversation. Yeah, so which leads to the next point, which is to invite you all. When you hear the phrase self-compassion, what kind of things come to mind for you? Being nice to yourself. Yes, thanks, Don. Not being hard on yourself. Kristen Neff, oh, Melissa, she basically is my entire section. Yes. Sleeping, oh, I love that, Andy. Supportive and flexible, thanks, Clarissa. Understanding my needs and capacities, so important, Mariah. And that we'll talk a little bit about that in resilience and learning how to say no. Understanding it's okay not to be perfect, forgiving ourselves. Sometimes good enough is what matters. And it's hard to let go of the expectation that we've put on ourselves, that our value and worth is only based on what we can produce, because we're more than that. And that's sometimes challenging. So thanks everybody for your thoughts. What self-compassion is self-kindness. You all hit on these pieces. It's also community, humanity, and connection. So if you're familiar, people don't really mean your best when they say your best. Yes, good enough, right? So sometimes what ends up happening is when we're dealing with things like self-esteem or performance, then we actually isolate ourselves because we can't be connected if we're always fighting against it. It being competition with other people of what's supposed to be the best thing, of how we're supposed to perform, and that creates this disconnection. And also mindfulness or being present with reality. And I'm very specific about this idea of sometimes we create fantasies in our mind, and they're not always pleasant fantasies. They could be anxiety-laden fantasies where if I don't do this, then this will happen, and then shame spiral. So we got to pull it back to what is the reality in the situation. And that sometimes means taking an objective stance, not emotionless, but objective of, and we'll talk more about this with motivation and resilience of what can I actually control, what is within my means, and am I actually capable of accomplishing it? Like legit, if I had a student come in for an intake and they're like, I have to get an A in this class and I'm failing, I'd be like, what are our other options? And how can I support you in a different way? So self-compassion is not self-esteem, like I mentioned. And I'm going to pull up a different slide on my side of things. So self-esteem depends on the comparison to others. And Roosevelt's uncredited with saying this, but comparison is the thief of joy. And I know at times when I'm comparing myself, I think about this a lot when I was in graduate school, and I'd see like, this person's doing these 5 other things and they're part of these professional organizations, and how am I not doing these things? And I want to be a valuable contributing member to our community. And so, but doing that, I'm losing sight of what's actually helpful for me. Self-esteem itself is also dependent on performance. So again, our values based on our accomplishments or never making mistakes, and we're going to believe we're pretty worthless if things don't go the way that we planned or hoped. So, and again, that's sort of like cutting our legs off at the knees, and saying like, now I'll try to run a marathon. It's just not going to work. And with that comes the self-judgment and isolation. Does this sound pretty familiar to folks? Okay, good. Who I can see, I'm seeing head nods, so that's helpful. Thank you. All right, some of the physiological aspects of self-compassion versus self-criticism. When we're not nice to ourselves, it activates our sympathetic nervous system. And when our sympathetic nervous system is basically the fight, flight, or freeze response. And when we're in that mode, we're not making good decisions. Now, maybe we're, because literally the system is there for us to not die and to survive. And when that's the case, we're not thinking forward. We're not able to see all parts and pieces, understand all of our options. And then if you think back to the isolation piece, if you're not turning to other people because you assume you're worthless if you reach out, just for any help, like, I don't understand how to solve this problem on the homework, can you help me? And you can't even do that, then it's going to cascade into a lot of other problematic situations that arise. But self-compassion itself activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is like the balancing system for the stress response. So when our parasympathetic nervous system is activated, we're in the rest and recovery. We're able to kind of take a step back and see all parts and pieces and make a thoughtful decision about what's next. So some sometimes, and I'm not saying anybody would do this, but when I have conversations with my clients about self-compassion, there's a lot of myths that they assume. So I just want to offer truths, because people don't, when you do myths and facts, people don't remember the facts, they remember the myths. So we're just going to focus on what are the facts. So self-compassion, we do not lose motivation when we increase our self-compassion. I hear a lot of students, and maybe some of you do this yourself, that, well, if I'm nice to myself, then I'm just not going to do my work. It's like, well, maybe there's a different discussion about, is this the right field for you? But that can be for another day. But people with greater self-compassion are more productive, and they in fact procrastinate less. And I think sometimes our students, and maybe even ourselves again, we can become stress junkies. So if we stress ourselves out so much by waiting until the last minute for whatever reason, the level of relief we experience when the task is done almost creates this perfect conditioned response where we don't know how to function without that high level of stress. So having conversations early on in the semester with your students about not recreating that pattern in the course could make the difference between people feeling fulfilled and invested throughout the entire semester than having to panic at the end of it. Self-compassion is not self-pity. We don't feel bad for ourselves when we're nice to ourselves. And these are just some other factors of how self-compassion can influence interpersonal relationships too. So we care more about other people, we have better relationships with others, which means that we're decreasing isolation, our support system is much greater, and we can overcome and engage in resiliency, which again, we'll talk about in a few minutes within this presentation. And the last piece I want to highlight is self-compassion, and I'm going to have typos, I'm just going to own that because that just happens. But self-compassion strengthens many areas of our lives. So we can cope better with traumas. If people experience a divorce, they're high in self-compassion, they handle it more effectively. They can cope better with chronic pain, which is as folks get older and our bodies don't work as well as they used to, or maybe we really abused it when we were younger and we didn't think about consequences because adolescent development, it's caught up with us. It's really valuable to know that you don't have to be happy that your body hurts, but you can appreciate the work that it can still do for you when it can. And then the big piece, academic failure, because it's gonna happen. I don't know about all of you, but I didn't get out of all of my degrees having done everything perfectly every time. Oh, thank you so much, Melissa. Please, so everybody, if you can see the chat, check out that article when you get a chance. Let's see. Any other truths you folks would want to add? You can feel free to jump in. All right, I do want to be mindful of our time, so I'm going to step forward on the slides. Thanks, Tiffany. That's true. I do accept my own typos. And I also use it as a form of humor, so I endear myself to you more. Because you see me as human. Yay. So ways to cultivate self-compassion. I think this is sometimes a point that people are like, okay, but how? So here are some options for your students or yourself. So encourage students to give themselves grace. And it's sort of the idea of crisis versus opportunity. Really easy to see a crisis moment as an opportunity after the fact, because maybe we weren't prepared to not be successful, which comes in to the conversation about resilience. But if you can help sort of with your relationship with your students, help them pump the brakes on that shame spiral and that distress, then you can help them understand their agency in the process and what they can do to make a difference. So challenging negative self-talk, and this feels like it's becoming sort of a movement on some of the social media I'm following. I cannot offer any exact empirical evidence for it, but this idea of like toxic positivity is not what we're going for. Saying like, you should be okay with failing your class because it's a learning opportunity is probably not going to help somebody in their instance. It's more of like, okay, I failed this exam because I didn't put the time and effort into studying that I could have, that would have resulted in a better grade. That takes the sting out of it. And it isn't saying like sunshine and rainbows, everything's going to be fine. So challenging negative self-talk. And then another piece is a compassion self-pause. And I'm going to put a couple links in here for it. So there's a PDF that is mindful parenting. So that's an option. And then the selfcompassion.org category of exercises. So that particular link is Kristen Neff's work. And if I could meet her and like shake her hand or even give her a hug, I would, and I'd get her autograph, because the work that she's done with this concept has been really amazing and impactful. And I wish more people knew about her. So all of these can be really fun for you to do yourselves, to try out when you have all that free time. And so I'd encourage that. Yes, okay, so Melissa asked, the word grace has strong religious connotations, though I'm hearing it frequently with self-compassion in context. Are there other ways to present this idea without marginalizing people who are uncomfortable with the potential religious implications? That is such a good point. And literally, as I was saying that phrase, I was like, I wonder how this is gonna land. And as a Jewish person, I'm aware that that concept of grace is not something that is really grounded in our ideals and kind of approach to life. And it does have a very strong Christian connection. So I'm just kind of curious, acknowledging that, like what other word would folks want to use or feel more comfortable with? Because maybe what would fit better would just simply to say like encourage to give them, or like giving themselves a break, right? Space for error. Love it. What other ideas are folks having? Flexibility and empathy, great. Peace, yep. Peace does have religious connections potentially, yeah. Patience or acceptance. I like it. So insert words there instead of grace. Thanks, Melissa, for bringing that up. I appreciate that. Cushion, I like it. Oh, we're getting good ones. Excellent. So remember to save this chat for all those times, all those conversations you're about to have with your students for these next 3.5 weeks. So I'm going to shift gears now to motivation. And so motivation in and of itself is this concept of like finding the why. So when we know why we have to do something, we're more likely to do it, period, and sometimes likely to do it well. Because I think about when I was like getting my degrees, I had areas of interest and I would love to take classes and be part of research with that. But if I had to take like a core class or a general class, I don't want to, but because it was then the pathway of getting the degree, I could accept that. So the hard part about motivation is that it's fickle. So some days we might feel really good and we wake up, maybe we had a great night's sleep, maybe we want to, or we just feel like we had great conversations the past day, we recharged our battery, so we feel like we could take on the world. And then sometimes maybe none of those things happened, or they still happen and we still don't feel like doing things. It's all an option. But with motivation, it's our general willingness to engage. And I want to be specific about willingness because I think sometimes when we face tasks or we're asking students to do things, they don't always recognize that it is in fact a choice. Like my partner and I have a really strong relationship, and when there were really hard times, he'd just be like, well, like, why don't you just quit tomorrow? And that statement, like I would have never quit. But just that statement helped me feel like, oh no, I could quit. The consequences would be unpleasant and the work that I put into this would be really disappointing to leave behind, but I could quit. And that helped me get through that period of time where motivation was a little more difficult to achieve. So I'm sort of curious for folks, what influences your motivation? Mood, goals, energy, time. Peers, sleep. The weather and how other people are doing. Good. Stress. Good. I think that what's happening in the world around us can influence our motivation if it's pulling our attention away. Like thinking about yesterday, found out when the verdict was supposed to happen, and I had a client at that same time, and it took a lot of energy to stay focused and to like completely make sure there were no distractions, which is hard because I'm on my computer all the time. Yeah. So that piece of what's going on around us. Can I actually accomplish what I need to do with the time I have and the energy I feel? Great. Yep. Good. Any idea I could walk away anytime? Help me look at intrinsic motivations. Great. Yes. Which we'll talk about, intrinsic and extrinsic values. So do you think your students are any different? No. I think sometimes what's hard for me, because I teach the online stress management class for EdSep, is that I forget, and the further I get away from it, the more I forget of what it was like to be a student. And even though I work with them every semester, and so not necessarily transporting myself back, but using the time and wisdom that I have of being a professional for as long as I have and will continue to be, can help me flex in a different way for students. So I'm still supporting their learning objectives and themselves as a whole person. Now, that doesn't mean I'm just going to like waive all of the expectations and requirements for a course because somebody's having a bad time, but being willing to like collaborate with them to make these decisions, and so that they feel like they have some agency in the process. And sometimes that does mean giving extensions, giving incompletes, and allowing them to finish up the work later, knowing that the consequences if they don't, then they fail the class. I mean, it's just like a reality. So it's motivation. It's about helping people find the why. Why am I doing this? So it takes knowing the price and being willing to pay it. I think about this fundamentally as your syllabus is your informed consent for your class. So if you craft it in such a way that there's clarity, the students know what they're getting in for, while still allowing yourself flexibility to either support or to shift as you need to, that can help a student take ownership of their own experience. So it's a difference between desire and reality. Sometimes, again, what we desire, an outcome we desire isn't always what's possible, and motivation can play a factor in that. And there's some ideas that we'll talk about in just a second. There's a Decky and Ryan self-determination theory, which we'll discuss in just a moment. But some of the ideas with motivation are, or different types of motivation, I should say, is there's rewards and consequences. So if you do X, you'll get Y, and that tends to be a short-term benefit. Guilt is sometimes a motivator. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I have to call my parents, it's because of guilt, not always because I want to, but then it still gets done. So another piece is doing something for a better future. They know why and are choosing to do it. So that one's a little thinking about it in the sense of relationships. So if I have to have a difficult feedback conversation with one of my staff, I don't want to do it, but I know that if I have the conversation and it's honest and transparent, then it could lead to a better outcome in the future. Painful in the moment, but potentially positive or better outcomes in the future. Doing something because you do it. This is that habit idea of motivation. Like we all get out, or most of us get out of bed most mornings, right? And it's habits sometimes. Now we have responsibilities and other things we have to take care of, but there's not really always a reward in that. And then there's the other piece for motivation of doing something because you love it. And sometimes your love of a thing can shift and change depending on all the things we talked about before with motivation. So just want to acknowledge some of those things. Oh, and the last piece, since Stu, you mentioned this in the chat, intrinsic versus extrinsic. So extrinsic value or motivation is like motivation to get something. So money is an extrinsic motivator. Intrinsic value is sort of like our internal values, our morals, our ethics, and those are the things that are driving us. And I like think about stopping at a stop sign in the country when there's nobody even around. You do it because it's how you were taught to do those things. So I'm going to put another link in the chat for information about the self-determination theory because we won't go into it in too much detail. So if you want to look into it more, it's sort of it's interesting, fun read. So a brief synopsis is an acronym, CAR. So competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So our motivation is highest when our perceived skill and level of ability to complete a task are elevated. And that's sort of like this idea of self-efficacy. And then autonomy, having control over our goals and outcomes. Now, when our students have to turn in assignments to do well in the class, that autonomy isn't maybe as a parent, but again, thinking about it's a choice. It's a choice to participate in the class. It's a choice to do the assignments. And if they choose not to, it's still their choice. There's just going to be outcomes that may be undesirable. And then the last piece is the relationship piece or relatedness. So a sense of belonging, having a strong support system, and having meaningful relationships, which in an in-person class, likely at this time of the semester, there's some cohesion. Your students are talking to each other before class gets started. Maybe they're talking more openly with each other around discussions you're having, spending time with one another outside of class. That loss has been strong this year. So again, don't want to pretend like this is a normal time. So, let's see. So ideas for building motivation into courses. So there's just some like catchphrases, so take them as you will. But practice makes permanent, and I like this idea because it circles back to the idea of self-compassion. We will none of us be perfect, no matter what. And we may do things very well, but then there will be times when we don't do things well, even if we've practiced. So practice makes permanent. Keep it simple, and I like this: little by little, a little becomes a lot. Create an environment where it's okay to fail, learn from it, and adapt. Now, again, this does take a level of ability to connect with your students, maybe in one-on-one ways, or, creating a culture of not shaming for making a mistake. I hear sometimes from other places where they will put, this is like a FERPA violation. So maybe that's not, it's a lie. I'm just going to pretend like I wasn't going to start that sentence. So never mind, ignore me. The other piece is to keep things in perspective. Doing something is better than nothing. And we did a workshop the other day, and it's sort of like some grad students talking about like, I can't even get this one, I can't write my thesis. It's like, well, have you started writing a sentence? And they're like, no, because I have to write my thesis. And it's like, and how do you write a thesis? It's like one sentence at a time. And then build in practice of self-affirmation or mantras. And this one is mine that I wanted to share. So taking a risk and being vulnerable here. But this idea, when I feel really stressed and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got to get this done. I've got to get it done. Why isn't it finished? And it's just like one of a long list of things, is like, it takes as long as it takes. And that to me feels it settles me, because then I can let go of expectations, of disappointment, and I can reflect on it afterward of like, could I have done something different? Probably. So, but in the meantime, it just takes as long as it takes. So Bird by Bird by Anne Lemmet is wonderful for the idea of writing or doing anything one step at a time. Nice. Thanks, Melissa. All right. So I'm looking at the time. We have 8 minutes and we're going to talk about resilience. We're doing great, everybody. So, oh, that's awesome. Looks like some other folks do it too. I'm going to look into that. So resilience, this is sort of that last piece that is sometimes more difficult. So what to do when the inevitable happens, failures, mistakes, and otherwise. And yes, crying is an option. It is always an option. So resilience itself is putting the pieces back together, or together to bounce back. And it isn't, I feel like this is almost one of the more kind of wispy ideas of like, but how do you cultivate resilience? What do you do exactly? So I'm going to try to offer some of those explanations, because on the face of it, it's like, well, it just seems so easy, right? You just like, you identify your motivation, you engage in self-compassion, and you can have resilience when you face adversity, but it's a little more complicated than that in a way. So resilience itself is developed over time. We're not born with it. We can't buy it. And we have to cultivate it. And part of the cultivation means we have to make mistakes. And that sometimes feels really scary for people. Because what we want to do a lot of times is avoid any sort of blow to our egos. And I don't mean that in the psychological sense of like Freudian id ego, superego, more just like our own self-image and how we perceive ourselves and want others to perceive us. It is not, resilience is not immunity or absence of pain, loss, or negative emotions. All those experiences are part of being human. And if you didn't have those experiences and those emotions, I would be concerned. And so I want you all to feel your wide array of feelings. Resilience is not a quick fix, and it is not unique to specific groups of people. It is a trait of humanity. So we go back to this idea of compassion and connection. We can all be resilient, and resilience can look different for others, but it's still something universally that we can all develop and possess. So let's see. A lot of it is in the way we talk to ourselves. So I'm going to offer some examples, and I would like you to consider if this is a resilience fostering or a resilience depleting statement. So the first statement is, this is hard, but I can get through it. Is that resilience fostering or depleting? Nice, great, thank you, good job. And this is a quiz and you will be graded. I'm just kidding. The next one, what's the point anyway? Is this fostering or depleting? What about this one? I will feel great about myself once this is all over. Fostering or depleting? Not sure, not sure. Yeah, yeah. If you think about this from a frame of hope, it's like, yeah, this sucks right now, but I'll feel better about myself later. This could be that tricky, like, fostering. And this, I think, is really consistent with people who have pretty negative self-talk. It's like, if I can just help you not hate yourself 100% and just like be a little nicer to yourself, great. It is definitely not the, this is hard, I can get through it idea. So that one was a little tricky and I liked it, but appreciate everybody for putting it out there. Let's see. This one, this will be the last one. So I've overcome difficulties in the past and I can find a way through this one. Is this fostering or depleting? Nice, yes, that's exactly right. And even as I kind of say that aloud, there's a sense of peace that can come with it. Like, yeah, this is hard, but we can do it. And this is no different than the semester we're all facing and that our students are going through right now. This sucks. It sucked for a year, more than a year, in fact. And, but we've got 3.5 weeks left, at least of school. We don't know when this pandemic is going to end. So good stuff. All right, so a little bit more. There are 3 kind of practices for resilience. There's commitment, control, and challenge. And so with the first one, with commitment, commitment itself is being engaged with your goals, your community, and striving towards growth. And this is not, you do not expect yourself or your students to do this all the time. This is sort of like when a lot of other things have lined up really well, and you have the energy to practice before something messes up and you have to tap into these skills. So this is where the practice piece comes in. So it can be built by considering what's most important to you. So taking time to reflect on those values, what are the top priorities of things, even thinking about these ideas of gratitude. Gratitude, there's so much literature coming out about gratitude and the use of treating, like as a part of a treatment plan for mental health concerns. And if any of you watch the show Big Mouth on Netflix, totally, okay, some folks do. If you can see this, if you can watch the episode this most recent season where you've got the gratitude, like that is not so different from what people are doing in therapy. And that is like, what are you grateful for? And how can we help you cultivate that gratefulness or that gratitude? Because when you can shift the lens just a little bit, it can make the difference between feeling hopeless and disconnected to finding kind of your foothold and to move forward. So some other actions with this is spending time with people or tasks that are important to us and trying new things. One of my colleagues has a sign on her door that's like, do your best to suck at something new. It's like, that's great. I love that. So awesome. And so let's see, I'm going to move on to the challenging piece or challenge piece. So challenge is seeing change and disruptions as opportunities to learn and grow. And again, it's hard to expect yourself or other people around you to do these things well in the midst of the crisis or the disappointment or whatever. So this is why doing the work between those unique opportunities can make it a lot easier to tolerate the other task, which again, self-compassion and motivation play into this. So changing, sorry, I have notes and I got lost for a second. See problems as part of life and set out to solve them. I think, again, we don't like to feel uncomfortable or disappointed. So how can we find that space to do it? Change our relationship with failing, avoid putting others on a podium, because that again taps into that self-esteem piece, which is not that great after all. We want higher self-compassion and self-efficacy, not self-esteem necessarily. Identify positive self-talk, take risks, let go of the past. Rumination is not good and creates other issues and doesn't allow you to be present with the reality of the situation. And then the last piece is related to control. So this I like to think of in a nutshell as accountability with self-compassion. So control is a belief that you can control outcomes in your life. And I think about this systemically of where power and privilege plays a huge role in control sometimes. So I just want to name that piece. But there are things that we can control related to academics that can sometimes make a big difference for ourselves. So the belief and understanding that we can read that chapter in the book, we can watch that lecture, we can go back and do that assignment, we can go to the lab and do the work. Like all these pieces are things that we can control and we have agency over. And then are we willing to accept the choices and responsibilities to create the life that we would like? It's this control piece. Yes, so those are, I'll go ahead and wrap up there because that's the end of the presentation. And I feel like that was a really abrupt ending, so thank you all for your patience. So I will stop sharing my screen, and with the time we have left, I think, do we go till 1 or do we like wrap up at 50?
We do go till 1. If you don't have until 1, that's completely
no.
fine too. I do try to end us at 1. I'm not always successful to get people to the next parts of their lives, but we do have to 1.
That's fair. Thank you. I do not. I can roll that. So, yeah. So I'm wondering what's coming up for folks. What questions or thoughts are you having? I appreciate the engagement in the chat and the additional links that folks shared. But I just wonder where this is landing for folks.
I think for me, I'm thinking a lot about just like, it's easy to get caught up in like what we've put in our syllabus at the beginning of the semester, and recognizing that like who I am right now is a really different person than who I was back in January when I had a couple weeks to like rest and recuperate and was feeling like a lot better about things again. And so like kind of going through and just being like, what can I change? And like reminding myself that like there are things that I can modify and
Yeah.
that's okay to make those shifts.
Yes, definitely. It's almost like if you could plan your fall syllabus right now, what might that look like?
So Cody, one of the things that I kind of struggle with right now is, I teach my students the more you feel, the less you think. And right now I'm doing a lot of feeling.
Yes.
So it's a little hard sometimes to kind of make decisions with all of these emotional overloads and burdens. And sometimes that impulsive first reaction decision is not the decision you kind of go with. So I'm wondering if you kind of have any tips on how to, in the moment, when that student hits you with yet another request, kind of thing, like, because you've mapped out, I think, kind of this overarching strategy, but I'm kind of wondering, when it happens, what can we do?
Yeah. And I think at least, sorry, like 5 things at once trying to come through my head. And I'm also holding on to your question, Melissa, from the chat. Time is in and of itself such a precious resource right now. And it's not just their time, it's our time. Because yes, working from home did have this glamorous appeal before we actually had to do it. And now we have no boundaries between work and school, and like work, life, and school, and all those other pieces that kind of play into it. But I can imagine what could be helpful with yet another request is to, rather than responding to their request right away, seeing about setting up or having somebody stay after class to just have a brief conversation of like, what is happening for you that this is still happening, and what support do you need that maybe is beyond what I can offer? And the other, sometimes what I end up doing, this doesn't seem to be okay, but it's like, I think it might just be in my style. So you can try this out if you want to, everybody. But when a student comes to me with a request and they're like, I know I haven't done any of my work, I was wondering if you would mind doing this, blah, 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 blah. And just sort of like reminding them of the policy and the syllabus, and inviting them to say, like, what do you think would be in a reasonable collaboration? Or what do you think would be reasonable as an option? And usually what they come to me with is actually pretty reasonable. And sometimes I think we are all of us better at being hard on ourselves than we are being hard on other people. So whatever decision they come with tends to be a little less flexible than I would have been if I'd made the decision myself. But sort of like, how do we kind of not be the ones to carry everything, but to help them carry some of it too, which is not always easy, right? I don't know. How's this landing, Don?
It's landing pretty well, and I think one of the things that I've thankfully, more often than not, they're decisions that are, the requests are coming over email. It's not on face to face with a student. So, I found for me, it's reminding myself not to reply today or to write the reply today, but to send it tomorrow.
Yeah.
To make sure that I am comfortable in all the ways with the decision that I've made.
Yeah.
I found in all semester I've been saying, we need to be empathetic, but that appears to be an exhaustible resource. So, kind of toward the end of the semester, I'm finding I have some empathy left, but that one student in particular may have used up all the empathy I have for that student. So it's those kind of moments that I'm kind of struggling with. Like, and you mentioned 3.5 weeks to go. It's like 3.5 weeks. I can anticipate the request and the request and the request, and I can start to kind of proactively think about what my reaction might be, something I'm gonna be comfortable with. One of the students I'm thinking about in particular, if I were to give that student the ability to come up with their own situation, I know it would be something I'm not comfortable with. I think
that's fair.
I don't know. I appreciated your perspective. It landed well to answer your question. It's just that I kind of know we're coming up on the hardest part. And it's been a really hard semester to this part. We have the hardest part still remaining.
For sure.
And I'm doing my best to kind of navigate it through in a way that I can feel good about myself as a person, and kind of create the best educational experiences for my students still remaining ahead.
Yeah, right. And I think the one thing we didn't talk about with this was the importance of boundaries, right? It's not just interpersonally, but holding a boundary and expectation with the class. And I think there's so much literature available for like K through 12 education, where they talk about, the difference between giving feedback and saying like, make these corrections because you like, this is the expectation on the rubric, versus like, I'm giving you this feedback, I'm setting this expectation because I believe that you can do this. Now, if you don't believe they can do it, then you have to decide if you want to like maintain self-respect by not lying to them, or if it would just be easier to lie. But that's another conversation. So yeah, I do want to speak to Melissa's question. What makes these concepts and skills hardest for students and humans to understand and adopt? I think that is so embedded in our culture that we, as an individualistic culture, it is about achievement and success and how we define success and what's important. And so if you are never allowed to make a mistake, or if you make a mistake, it means that you're a failure and it's not, and that you're not worth it, then you can't untangle those so easily. And another kind of component is, we haven't touched on like our historically underrepresented students. Like, those number of students are going to consistently increase throughout the years, and we're still we're working, right? But we're still embedded in this very your white supremacist approach to education, and how do you demonstrate knowledge, and how you meet those expectations, and even the standards from which we set them. And again, that's another conversation beyond the scope of this, but I think it's hard because it's a culturally bound kind of experience. So change the process form final product from the original. Any adjustments should not be harder for me to do than the student. Yeah, that's true. That is very true, Suzanne. Thank you for making that point. Well, and also, I mean, if you think about it, not from like an accommodations perspective, and this is an ADA compliant thing, so making adjustments is not the same as accommodations, but it cannot substantially alter the requirements for the course. So this is not so different from that of like absolving them from any responsibility. Because yeah, sure, all students could get an A if they didn't have to do anything. So.
So Cody, we are about out of time. I'm going to stay around for a second if anyone has any further conversations. I just want to make a couple of announcements. Our professional development series is continuing on. Next week, Pat Ackerman will talk to us about online education through the lens of technical communication, readability, and plain language. We'll be back to our original Zoom link. We will have ironed out the tech issues before then. I'm very confident. Also, we have professional development certificates and applications for fellow status that are coming up. So please check out our website for that information. All the information is also in our newsletters every week to get you the links to all of that. And I would like to end by thanking Cody Wallace for doing a wonderful presentation about compassion and resilience and all the things that I think I needed to hear today. So thank you so much for that, Cody.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I do have a client, so I need to bounce. But if you have questions, my email's in the chat. So don't hesitate to contact. And then I will send out the PowerPoint to Ashley, who will send it out to everybody else. So have a great Wednesday and hang tight, everybody. We're almost done.
Thank you, Cody.
Thank you.